Woohoo! We did it. We finished RoboFriends. We finished our app. Now we can forget about it and it's going to live forever and ever on the internet. Right? Well, maybe not. You see, part of using a library is something we've already talked about. A library or a framework is constantly evolving, constantly changing. And every time you use a tool, you usually want to stay up to date. This is one of the challenges with being a programmer, that you always have to stay up to date. I mean, sure, your projects could live on GitHub, but eventually they get stale. If they have a lot of dependencies or libraries that they depend on, then things might not work as intended. Now, this doesn't mean that you always have to jump on the latest and greatest. And as libraries come up with new features, you don't necessarily need to jump on them right away. But in these next couple of videos, I want to actually show you what my steps are and what most programmers' steps are when things change. Because if you have an application that is running, that has users, most of the time you want to keep things up to date. And this is something we've already talked about. But what about things like React? We learned about React in this course, and we're starting to get comfortable with it. But again, because it's a library, it gets updates because it's being used by companies like Facebook that has teams that constantly need new things, find challenges, and want to improve it. Ideally, things are always improving. So React had a big update. As of version 16.8, it got something called hooks. Now, if you know anything about React, everybody is going a little crazy with hooks because they are quite a big shift. They are exciting, but can also be intimidating for a beginner. And you can see over here in their documentation that they have a new section on React hooks. Over the next couple of videos, we're going to be talking about React hooks, what they are, why they're useful. But instead of just showing you point by point, as it is in the documentation, how hooks work, because let's be honest, you're able to do that on your own. That's what these documentations are for. I want to show you the process, how I would learn something new when a library changes, when a library has a new feature. Now, the reason I haven't talked about hooks up until now is that, well, even React documentation actually doesn't talk about hooks until way later in their guide. When you learn about React, their main concept, some of the advanced guys, some API references, they don't mention hooks until the very end. So when you learn about React, it's good to put off hooks until you actually understand the concepts, which hopefully you do until now. So let's say React comes up with hooks. How would you go about learning it? Well, obviously you'd start off with the documentation and start going through it and actually understand it. Now, starting in the next video, we're going to learn about hooks, but I'm going to show you the process of how I would learn about hooks and then also convert our RoboFriends app from using the class stateful components to using React hooks so that you can compare them side by side and see what the differences are. I'll see you in the next one. Welcome back. Let's learn about hooks and also teach you how the process should be when you learn something new with a library. Because again, your job as a programmer is to be really good at problem solving, be able to adapt to changes and solve problems. So let's say hooks was just introduced to React. The very first thing I would recommend to do is to read the documentation, but more importantly, read the motivation. Why did the library add this? Why did React decide to add this thing called hooks? Now we see over here that they're a new edition as of 16.8. And if you're watching this video now, there's probably a way later version of React. So as long as you're using this version or higher, you're going to be able to use this new feature. Now, I'm not going to read through the entire documentation for you, but I do want to point out one thing. The number one thing I do when I look at a library and see some of the new changes, I want to look at the motivation. Why did they add it? So if I scroll down, look at that. They have the motivation. Why do we need hooks in the first place? Now, Sometimes to learn what the motivation is, you have to actually understand the library and have used it before. And hopefully by now you're comfortable with React. So let's just go through the motivation quickly, and then we'll get to coding because I know that's the exciting part and that's when we'll actually learn. But the 3 things to keep in mind is that 1, with the ways that we've used React up until now, it's really hard to do this. Reuse stateful logic. What does that mean? Well, if we had some logic of, let's say, changing state in our class components, sometimes if we want to do something similar in another component, it's a little harder to do with the way that we had it before. Hooks makes this a little bit easier. Again, something that we'll see shortly. Next is that complex components become hard to understand. You see, as components become bigger and bigger, especially class ones with component did mount, component did update, component will unmount, all these lifecycle hooks, things that can happen within a component, hooks make things a little bit cleaner. You can see over here, hooks let you split one component into smaller functions based on what pieces are related. Again, hard to really understand unless we code it. But the biggest motivation, and I think this is something that a lot of people overlook when talking about hooks, is that some people find classes confusing. This keyword, the bind function that we have to do. Classes are just daunting for some people, such as doing super props. Why do we do that in a class? So hooks allow us to not use classes, not use the this keyword in our React applications. And another major reason that is overlooked is that React wants to do something called ahead of time compilation one day, hopefully for performance, something that things like Svelte, Angular, and Glimmer do. And by not having classes, it makes this easier for them to do so. But you know what? This is a lot of talk, a lot of gibberish, maybe hard to understand. I think the best way to learn about hooks is to actually convert our RoboFriends app from using class components to using hooks. And I'll show you what that means in the next video. Bye-bye. All right, let's convert our RoboFriends app from using classes to using hooks and learn about what the differences are. So the very first thing I want to do is, well, clone this repository. So we'll use our RoboFriends example, and I'll just say git clone and grab this repository from GitHub. Or you can use your existing project. Now I'm going to go into the RoboFriends directory. And the very first thing I always want to do when I clone a repository is obviously npm install. So let's run that to install all of our dependencies. All right, npm install worked. Now, one of the things that will happen, and this is something we've already talked about, is that whenever you're revisiting an old project or grabbing a project from GitHub that has been around for a while, is that, well, you'll get a lot of vulnerabilities because libraries haven't been updated. So the first 2 commands that I always like to do after npm install is npm update to update my libraries. All right, only one low severity vulnerability after the npm update. And sometimes I also like to run npm audit fix just to make sure that we're not missing anything. And looks like we're good to go. You see here that there is one vulnerability that requires manual review. So we'll have to manually update those. But for now, I think everything's good. Everything's up to date. So we can start using hooks. Now, the very first thing I want to do is to make sure that we can use this new feature. Remember that hooks came with React 16.8. So let's go check to see that we have React 16.8 or higher. So I'm going to open Visual Studio Code. And I know, shocker, up until now, I've loved Sublime Text, but it looks like a lot of people like Visual Studio Code. So I have to conform to what everybody else is doing, just so that you get to see a different editor as well. All right, so we have our terminal here to the right, and then we have our RoboFriends app. If we take a look at package.json, let's see over here what version we have. We see that we have React 16.13, so higher than 16.8, so we should be able to use hooks. Awesome. The very last thing before we move on to the next video and finally introduce you to hooks, because I've talked a lot about them and you still have no idea what they are. Let's just do npm start to make sure that everything still works. We've updated our packages. We want to make sure that things are still working. So npm start, hopefully we get no errors. All right, looks like things are loading up. On the console, there's no error, and I can search my robot friends. And again, things are working. Awesome. All right, time for hooks. I know. I keep building the suspense, but I promise next video, we're going to find out what hooks are. See you in that one. Bye-bye. All right, it's time to learn about hooks. Now, the very first thing that we need to answer is, what are hooks? Well, if we take a look at the documentation, there's a section here that says, what is a hook? And we see over here that hooks are a function that let you hook into React state and lifecycle features for function components. Hooks don't work inside classes. And that's the thing. All hooks are is if we go to our container, the app.js, let's minimize this. There you go. The app.js is using a class component. And remember, hooks are a way for us to avoid using classes so that we can avoid the super keyword, the this keyword that some people find confusing. Even things like component did mount, that these lifecycle hooks that sometimes can get confusing. So hooks allow us to use functional components, which remember, we have talked about. Our components are functional components, right? They're just functions that render something. But before hooks, we only created functional components once when we didn't have any state inside of them. All these components are what we call just presentational components, right? They just return something, they just receive props and return some sort of a view. But anytime we wanted to use state, we had to convert those functions into a class component so that we can do this .state and declare our state. With hooks, what you get is that you can now add state to a function. So because we have version 16.8 or higher of React, we can convert this app class into a function. Now, here's the thing. I want you to practice reading documentation here. Oftentimes, whenever we are introduced to a new concept, our default is to, hey, let's go find a tutorial online. Let's go buy a course that teaches us this. But the best resource is usually the documentation. The documentation is created by the people that actually created React, actually created the hooks API. So they usually have good resources for you to learn and use. So as an exercise, before we dive into the next video and I show you how we can start converting this with hooks, I want you to go into the hook section of the React documentation and see if you can figure out how to keep this app the exact same way that it is. It still works. You can still search through your robot friends, but you convert this class app into a functional component. And instead of having things like constructor or component did mount, to just convert this all into using hooks. I'll give you a little hint. In order for us to do this, we'll have to import two things from React that we now have available because we've updated. One is something called useState, which is a hook. So it's called the useState hook. And the other one is called the useEffect, which is another hook. You see, hooks essentially give us that. They give us hooks like this from the React library for us to implement and use inside of our functional component to finally have state and lifecycle methods. So if you want to give it a go and convert this into a functional component that uses hooks, go ahead. Otherwise, I'll show you how to do this in the next video. Bye-bye. All right, all right, all right. Hopefully you were able to do that little bit of a challenge. If not, no worries. I'll show you how we can convert things into using hooks in this video. But again, hopefully you got a chance to check out the using the state hook and using the effect hook in the React documentation. Because it's not as hard as it seems. Remember what I said. Hook is a special function that lets you hook into React features. So the use state and the use effect hook allow us to hook into a React feature, because it's from the React library, to either work with state or with lifecycle methods. So the first thing I want to do is to actually remove this component from here, because we're no longer using that component class to extend app. Instead, we want to change this into a function, right? So I can now say function app, and we remove this and turn this into a function. Next is we no longer need this constructor, super, and this.state. Because we're now creating a function, we can, let's say, comment this out for now just so we can see it. We are also going to comment component did mount, because inside of a function, there's no such thing as component did mount. Remember, we got component did mount because we were able to use the component class in here that gave us this feature, this lifecycle hook. So now we can't use this either. And then because this is a function, what we need to do is turn this into a variable. So the onSearch change and the render is no longer needed. Instead, we'll have this piece of code that just simply returns out of the function. So if I save this, I'll probably get a few errors. All right, so I have useState is defined by never used. UseEffect is defined by never used. onSearch is assigned but never used. And that's because onSearch now is just a variable inside of this function. And you see that we're using the this keyword here. Remember what I said, because we're no longer in a class, we don't need the this keyword anymore. So if I save this, we have one less error. Now, if I go back to our app, we have some errors. Cannot read property state of undefined. And that's because, again, we're using the this.state here, and we've commented out the constructor that gave us state, right? So this.setState that came from our component class no longer exists. This.state no longer exists either, again, because it's no longer a class. So how do we create state now? Remember, hooks give us now the power to have state inside of our apps. And we do that using the useState hook. Let's find out how to do that in the next video. Let's talk about the state hook. And this is the most common, most important hook out of all of them. And if we check out the documentation, we see that the useState is a hook. We call it inside a function component to add some local state to it. So this is exactly what we need. So we need now the useState hook to replicate whatever we did in the constructor here to create the state. So the way we do that is a little tricky, so hang with me here and then I'll explain exactly what's happening. We first declare a constant, and in here we'll do array destructuring. That is, the useState hook is going to return for us two things. One is the robots. Remember, this is part of our state. And the second thing is the function that changes this robots. And usually the standard naming convention is to say set with the name of whatever the state that we're changing is. So we'll say set robots. So const robots is the state now, and set robots is the function that changes this state. So we're going to say equals use state, which we've imported from here. And then in the use state, we give it the initial state. So what's the initial state of robots? Well, right over here, it's an empty array. So we just give it an empty array. And again, this is a bit of a magic that's happening with React. This idea of hooks isn't a JavaScript context. It doesn't really exist in the JavaScript world. Hooks are very React specific, so there is a bit of magic that's happening. In this case, we just need to understand that useState returns for us just by doing this. It's going to return for us, one, a piece of state, and second, the function that changes that state. So we can change or name these variables whatever we want to describe our state. So that's our first piece of state. And then the next one is the search field. So once again, I'll say const. And what should we put here? Well, the search field. And then the function that changes the search field. So again, using the standard, we'll do set search field is going to equal use state. And what is the initial state? Well, the initial state is an empty string. There you go. That's it. We've just recreated this part, except now our function has state. It has the robots state and it has the search field state. And you'll also notice that it's not in one big state. Instead, we've sliced things. So we have one state for robots and one state for search field, and we keep them separate. Now, this initial state can be anything you want. You see here how this.state was an object, and if we wanted to, we could make this into an object, but this is completely up to you and what state you want to have in your app. Now, another thing that tricks a lot of beginners is this array destructuring, which is a new JavaScript feature. Essentially, what this allows us to do is it allows us to name our state whatever we want. So even though useState returns for us a piece of state, which will be an empty array initially, and a function to change that state, by using array destructuring, we can customize our code and name it whatever we want instead of the useState library that React gives us, naming it in one way that everybody has to use. This is just simple array destructuring to name our variables. Now that we have a piece of state, we'll forget about the component did mount for now. We're going to go to the on search change event. And we see here that instead of doing on search change, what we'll do is remove this .setState because we're no longer in a class. And instead, to change the search field, all we need to do is say set search field. So this .setState changes to set search field. And this search field can be changed. So in this case, because we just give it exactly what the change needs to be, we can just remove the object here and just say event.target.value is going to set the search field. So we got rid of a this. And then what else do we have here? This.state here we no longer need because again, we don't have a state object. Each robots and search field is already here. So we can just remove this entire line because we already have access to robots and search field. And then if we go here, robots.filter, we have that. Any more this around here? No, everything should be good. Let's save. We see that set robots is assigned a value, but never used. And that is because we haven't implemented the component did mount yet. But let's have a look. If I go back to our app, it's loading because we haven't fetched anything. But if I open up the developer tools and console, and let's just log out over here. Let's just do console.log robots and then search field. If I save and go back, we see that we have an array and an empty string. So we have state, we've created state inside of our function using the use state hook that allowed us to finally do exactly what we did with a class component, but in a functional way. Next step is to add the lifecycle hooks. Again, remember what hooks are. Hook is a special function that lets you hook into React feature. We've hooked in to the state feature of React so that we can create state. The next part is to hook in to the lifecycle events that we got with classes, but this time within a function. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye. Welcome back. Let's talk about the second most important hook, and that is the effect hook that comes with React. Now, the effect hook adds the ability to perform side effects from a function component. It serves the same purpose as component did mount, component did update, component will mount in React classes. Again, remember, the whole idea of hooks is to be able to do the things that we were able to do inside of a class, but this time inside of a function. And we see here that we can use effect like a function and just tell it what we need to do. So let's give it a go. I want to use effect now to replace this component did mount, because right now our robots aren't being fetched. Our friends are non-existent because we're not fetching. So let's do this. Let's do use effect. We have that because, remember, we've imported over here. And use effect is going to run like this. And inside of use effect, we have to tell it what is the side effect that we want this function to do. So I'm going to just create an arrow function. And inside of here, we're going to put this fetch call that we had in component did mount. So let me just comment that out. Make sure our spacing is correct. And inside of here, we now have use effect. And this use effect gets run every time the function app gets run automatically. So we see over here that we're calling use effect because of the brackets, and inside of here, we're telling it, hey, what's the side effect? So this is something important to remember. By default, React runs this use effect function after every time it renders. So when app renders, it's going to run the use effect and whatever is inside of it. Now remember, we no longer have this .setState. Instead, we have, what are we changing? We're changing the robots. So I can say set robots right over here. And this set robots is going to get the new users. Like that. Now, let me save this and see if this works. I'm going to save. All right, compiled successfully, no errors, but do we get our robot friends? Let's have a look. Hey, look at that. We have our robot friends. Love it. Can I search through them? What? Look at that. So simple, and it works just as expected. But let's take a look at the console. If I open up the console, I don't know if you can tell here, but look how many times this render function is running. It just keeps going. It's actually running in an infinite loop right now. Let's take a look and find out why that is. And this is another tricky part when people get started with hooks. Again, it's often commented in the documentation, which you can read on the React website. Now, this use effect actually has a second parameter that it receives. Remember, the first parameter is the function, what it should do when app renders. And the second one is this. If present, which is an optional argument, if present, effect will only activate if the value in the list changes. What does that mean? Well, use effect receives an array as a second argument. Now, before I just show you what this does, let's have a look at why exactly the use effect was running continuously over and over and over. Well, if we look at the code, when the app renders, it creates the state, right? That's the initial state. And then it runs the use effect because it rendered. So it fetches the users, and then these users are going to update the state. It's going to update the robot state with the new users. So what happens? Well, new users are being rendered right here. So the app re-renders and says, hey, I got new robots. So I need to re-render myself to show the robots. So it re-renders. But remember what I said with use hooks. Every time the component re-renders, it's going to run use effect. So it's going to run fetch again. And then it's going to set robots again. So it has to re-render. And then it goes use effect again, then set robots. So it goes into a continuous loop. And the trick with use effect is that if you don't want this to constantly re-render, then you wouldn't want to set state inside of use effect. But if we are setting state like we have here, we can give it an optional list. And this optional list tells us in here, hey, when should I run use effect? So you can tell React to skip applying the effect or the use effect function if certain values haven't changed between re-renders. So in here we say, hey, only run use effect if one of these have changed. So for example, if I put in robots here and I save, what will happen? If I go back, oh, you see that it's still running. Look at that. It's still running, still running, still running. Why is that? Well, because robots changes, right? We always run set robots. So that means, hey, run use effect because robots changed. Hey, run use effect because robots changed. That's exactly what we're doing before without the second argument. But in here, if we do, let's say, search field, only run use effect if search field changes. If I save this and go back, there you go. It no longer goes into that infinite loop. But if the search field changes, you'll see that we're fetching again. So that's not good either. Instead, we want to give it an empty list or an empty array. Because what does that mean? It means, hey, only run use effect when this changes. But when the list or the array is empty, it's a shortcut for doing component did mount. Hey, just run use effect initially when the component mounts, when app is rendered. So the component did mount shortcut is essentially this, adding an array. I know it's tricky, maybe it doesn't make sense. It's just a quirk, a thing that you just have to remember with React. Remember, hooks aren't a JavaScript thing. It's just a way to use React that you need to get used to, just like you had to get used to this .set state. So by having an empty array here, I now replicated component did mount. So now if we just move console.log over here to use effect, so inside of use effect, we'll ignore the warnings for now. If I go back, you'll see that it's an empty array. But as soon as I type something, no other updates are made because use effect is only run once. Versus before when we didn't have anything, and you see that it was going like crazy. So this is a shortcut. Remember, component did mount, we just add the empty array. And then we can give it different options inside of this array. Now, if you're using Create React App, this actually gives you a hint here whenever you're using it incorrectly. So React hooks use effect has missing dependencies, robots, and search field. Either include them or remove dependency array. And what this is saying is, hey, inside of use effect, you have two pieces of state, robots and search field that you're using. Now, in our case, we're just console logging, but it gives you a warning saying, hey, don't you want these to run if you're using them inside of use effect and add them to the dependencies? So it's saying this, hey, just add these. And you see that it's compiled successfully. But again, we don't want to do that because remember, robots change all the time. So if we do that, it turns into an infinite loop. So let's remove and remove. There we go. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye. All right. So I know this part is a little tricky. When you first start off with hooks, it can be a little overwhelming. It's why the React documentation doesn't really teach hooks until later on, because it makes a lot more sense once you understand this idea of class components, this idea of lifecycle hooks. But if we just remove our alt code that has been commented out, you see that our code reads pretty nicely. It's just a function, except this function now has some state that we usually declare at the top and a use effect, a side effect that we do every time we run the app, and we tell it when we want to run this use effect in the second argument that is an array. The other parts are pretty self-explanatory, just like we've built components before. Now, to really solidify our knowledge here, I want to do one other thing just to make sure that we really get these hooks concept. Let's say I wanted to create a button. And let's just say that this button lives right here, right below our title. And this button is going to say just click me. And it's going to have an onClick function. And this onClick function we haven't written yet, but I'm going to just say that it's going to have a set count that we haven't created yet. So this is going to be a function that changes a new piece of state. And this time around, we'll just have a new count state. So I'm going to create a piece of state. I'll call it count and set count. So you kind of see the repetition here. We're just creating state at the top with what the state name is and what the function is that changes that state. And I'll say use state, and I'll just give it a count of 0. So this is going to be 0. And this set count is going to be right over here. And when a user clicks, it's going to run set count, and we'll just say count plus 1. So we're just incrementing a counter. So on click, set count, and it's going to add 1 to the count. If I save this and go back, you see that I have click me here. And let's just console log this so we can see it. Let's do it right after the fetch, just so we understand exactly what's happening here. If I do console.log count, okay, if I save this, we should understand what the error is, or the warning that we get on the right side. Hey, how come inside of use effect you have count, but you're not adding anything in here? Let's just save this and see what happens. If I go over here, see that I have 0. If I click me, nothing happens. And why is that? You should be able to answer that, right? Because we've added no dependency to this use effect, nothing in the array, which means, hey, just run it once when app loads. If I refresh the page, again, just run it once. But after that, don't run it. So how can I solve that? Well, we just add count in here. And that's what the warning is telling us. Hey, don't you want to add count? If I add count, now every time I click, it's going to run the use effect. But this also means that we're constantly fetching our users. If I go to the network tab and I click me, you see that we get users. We make that fetch API call every time. So this line simply means only run if count changes. Right? And that should make sense. I just wanted to show that example just so you understand exactly what is happening here. Because at first, use effect can be tricky. But hopefully this clears things up for you. Now, I'll link to the repo of this finished code so you can play around with it and try new things. But hopefully, hooks aren't as intimidating as you initially thought. At the end of the day, we're just converting our class components into stateful functional components. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye. Welcome back. So should you replace all your React class components with functional components with hooks? Well, not really. One of the key things in the React documentation is that hooks work side by side with existing code, so you can adopt them gradually. Classes aren't going anywhere. They're going to be around. For example, the creators of React, which were the developers at Facebook, say, at Facebook, we have tens of thousands of components written as classes, and we have absolutely no plans to rewrite them. Instead, we're starting to use hooks in the new code side by side with classes. Just because a library introduces a new feature doesn't mean that your code now needs to all be updated. Hooks are just an additional tool in your tool belt as a programmer for you to use. But out there in the wild, there's still lots of class components. If you work for a company, you're most likely going to see class components. So you need to understand both things, but also understand some of the ways that hooks might make things nicer, depending on your team, depending on your situation. So React documentation actually doesn't recommend rewriting your existing components overnight. You can start experimenting with hooks, starting to use them, start getting comfortable with them, but by no means is your code incorrect just because you use classes. You see, libraries change all the time. New APIs are formed all the time. That's why when you work as a programmer, it's not about learning the latest and greatest tools just to show how current you are. What you need to do is to be able to read documentation, understand what is the motivation behind the change, what is the motivation behind the new feature, and learn to use it slightly, and then if you need it, if it makes you productive, if it makes your code more readable, then use it. But don't use it just because it's new. So I recommend playing with your RoboFriends app, trying out different hooks, but I do want to go over two other things. One is the rules of hooks. There's two things that you have to remember. You can only call hooks from React function components. So you can't really call them outside of that. Only call hooks from React functions. So you can't actually call hooks in regular JavaScript functions. Remember, hooks are very React specific. So what you learn about hooks doesn't translate to anywhere else but React, which is a little unfortunate. And also part of the reason that I'm not spending too much time teaching you hooks. The next one is that you can only call hooks at the top level. You can't call hooks inside of loops, condition, or nested functions. So you declare a functional component, and at the very top, you use hooks. Just like we have had here. I can't use effect or the state inside of if conditions or other functions. Again, just rules that we have to keep in mind because they are React specific. Finally, you can actually build your own hooks. Remember, one of the main motivations that React introduced hooks was to have a reusable state logic. If you have complex state logic, like let's say in here, having a friend status with isOnline and setIsOnline that you want to use across different components, you can actually create your own hooks and combine useState and useEffect and share it across components. Now, this is very dependent on the component that you're building, so I do recommend you read the documentation, because if you go to the hooks API reference, beyond useState and useEffect, there's a few other ones that you can use. As you can see, there's not that many, and most of the time you'll be using these two, but you can quickly get started in understanding how these work or even create your own. But the thing I want to remind you is that in your career, you're always going to see new features added to the tools that you're using. It's not about just jumping on the bandwagon from day one and converting your app to the latest and greatest, newest feature. Instead, decide for yourself, learn about what it does, what the motivation is, and decide for your own project, for your own team, whether those updates are necessary. Often, senior developers are able to not jump on the bandwagon right away because they know that new things are constantly changing. New things are still being adopted. Best practices are forming. So take your time when new things are introduced to a library, understand the motivation, read the documentation, play around with the feature, and then decide for your situation if it's the right thing to do. I don't recommend spending too much time on hooks unless you really want to get into React because it doesn't really translate anywhere else. And the reason we've taught this section in this order is because classes are things in JavaScript that you can use in other parts of your projects, other parts of your programming career, versus hooks is so specific. So unless you want to be a React developer, it's not really worth your time and investment learning them. Now I have full dedicated courses on React if you want to dive deeper. But otherwise, I think we're pretty happy with this RoboFriends app. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.